I was dead for 11 seconds. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I saw was a note from my daughter. "We're in Honolulu. Hope you feel better when we're back." They say when your heart stops, you don't feel a thing. I did. It was a cold sting that ripped across my chest, like barbed wire being yanked from inside my ribs. The sharp whine of the flatline monitor still echoes in the back of my skull when things get too quiet. And when I came back, when the paddles jolted me into the cruel mercy of consciousness, I didn't see faces. I saw fluorescent light trembling above me like it was trying to flicker out of its own shame. I was 65. I had taught literature for 37 years. I had raised 2 daughters mostly on my own after their father died. And I had just come back from the dead, only to discover that death might have been kinder. The nurse's name tag read Carlos. He had soft brown eyes that darted away every time I looked at him too long. He called my name like it hurt his throat to say it. "Mrs. Renner. Margaret? Can you hear me?" I blinked. My throat was dry, bone dry. My tongue felt like sandpaper. I couldn't speak. My body wouldn't move the way it used to. My hands, once steady enough to grade stacks of essays in a single sitting, now trembled, just trying to reach the edge of the blanket. Carlos adjusted my IV and gave me a tight smile. "We're going to keep you comfortable. You've been through a lot." I wanted to ask about my girls, Alyssa, Madeline. Had they been there when it happened? Had they screamed, cried, prayed? But no words came, only the heavy pressure of a ventilator that still hummed somewhere near my ear. Later, when Carlos stepped out to take a phone call, I heard his voice drift in from the hallway. He didn't know I was awake. I don't think he would have said it if he had. "Yeah, she's stable now." "Uh-huh." "Yes, Mom. She's conscious. Would you like to speak with her?" Pause. "Okay. I just thought you'd want to know." That pause. It wasn't silence. It was betrayal wrapped in a whisper. They didn't want to talk to me. My own daughter had refused the call. When Carlos came back in, his hands were softer, more careful, like he was handling someone already half gone. I didn't ask. I didn't have to. I saw it in his eyes. They weren't coming. No visitors, no flowers, no familiar voices, just machines, nurses, and the cold hum of sterilized loneliness. I was in the ICU for 8 days. 8 days of watching sunlight crawl up the window in the morning and slide down at dusk, like God was drawing curtains on a performance I didn't ask to star in. 8 days of meals I couldn't eat and shifts I didn't care to notice. 8 days of silence so loud it made my bones ache. Then came the note. It was folded neatly on the tray beside my bed, tucked beside a single-use plastic spoon and a half-eaten cup of Jell-O. I hadn't noticed it until I tried to shift upright and knocked the spoon onto the floor. I unfolded the paper with stiff fingers. It was Alyssa's handwriting. "Mum, we're in Honolulu. The girls needed a break, and Brad booked the trip months ago. Hope you feel better when we get back. Just rest, okay? We'll call in a few days." 12 days. They were gone for 12 days. While I lay in a hospital bed, my heart rebooting, lungs stitched to machines, they were drinking cocktails under palm trees and snapping photos with fake filters and hashtags like #self-care and #family first. I didn't cry. I didn't have tears left. I just stared at the paper like it had been written in another language. Some part of me, the quiet, decaying part that still wanted to believe the best, told myself maybe they just didn't know how bad it had been. Maybe Carlos hadn't explained it right. Maybe it all happened too fast. But deep down, under the morphine and the murmurs, I already knew. They weren't there because they didn't want to be. There's a difference between being busy and being unwilling. They chose Hawaii over me, chose beach towels over my deathbed. The next morning, I tried sitting up on my own. It took nearly 10 minutes. My body trembled with the weight of itself. My legs refused to bear me. The nurse tried to help, but I waved him off. "I need to go home," I whispered, my voice like crushed gravel. Carlos blinked. "You're being discharged in 2 days, Mrs. Renner. But there's no one listed to pick you up. We tried calling again." I nodded, more to myself than to him. Of course they wouldn't come. I insisted on leaving early, fought through the bureaucracy, signed every paper with a shaky but determined hand. Carlos offered to wheel me out. He looked embarrassed doing it, as if he knew I deserved better than a silent send-off and a nurse's apology smile. Outside, the sun burned too bright. The transport van was late. I sat alone under the metal canopy of the hospital's front entrance, my hospital bag at my feet, and the discharge papers clutched like a lifeline. I had no one waiting for me. No one even knew I was alive. The ride home was quiet. The driver didn't talk. I didn't want him to. When we pulled up to my house, I noticed something strange. The ceramic frog on the porch, where I always hid my spare key, was empty. I asked the driver to wait. He didn't. He drove off, so I sat, on the porch, in the heat, for 22 minutes. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Alyssa. It wasn't Madeline. It was Bradley, my son-in-law, in gym shorts and flip-flops, holding a Starbucks cup like it was a shield. His expression was a mix of surprise and awkward guilt, the kind you see in children who've been caught playing with matches. "Margaret, hey," he stammered. "We, weren't expecting you till Thursday." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I just stepped inside and felt the shift in the air, like the walls themselves didn't recognize me anymore. And that was the moment I knew. This wasn't neglect. It wasn't forgetfulness. This was a choice. They had already started erasing me. And if they thought I wouldn't notice, they'd forgotten who the hell raised them. If you've ever been made to feel like a burden, if you've ever had to walk away just to keep your dignity intact, this story is for you. Share it with someone who needs to remember that they are allowed to choose peace. And if you see yourself in these words, leave a comment. You are not alone. Bradley didn't step aside at first. He stood there in the doorway like he needed time to process whether I was real, or perhaps whether the ghost he and Alyssa had tried to bury had come back for one last haunting. His grip tightened around the Starbucks cup. A smear of lipstick, Alyssa's shade, decorated the lid like a casual insult. "Mom," he said finally, voice rising like a teenager caught sneaking out. "We, weren't expecting you back so soon. Thought it'd be Thursday." I didn't answer. I simply looked him dead in the eyes, long enough for the silence to bruise. Then I stepped past him, letting the threshold close behind my shoulder like a door shutting on grace. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Fresh paint. Not the soft eggshell blue I had chosen 10 years ago with Frank, but some trendy taupe shade you find in flip-it-fast home renovation shows. It didn't feel like home. It felt like staging. My cane clicked softly against the hardwood as I walked in. I moved slowly, partly because my legs still remembered the ICU, and partly because I needed to take in what they had done, deliberately, quietly, without asking. The family photos from the hallway were gone. In their place, Framed prints of generic landscapes, a field of lavender, a cabin by a lake, an empty road that led nowhere. They were the kind of images you buy in bulk from craft stores. Meaningless, decorative, soulless. My wedding portrait had been taken down from above the mantel. I found it boxed in the corner of the living room with a yellow post-it slapped onto the frame. Too dated. Donate? The fireplace, where we used to hang stockings for the girls, now had a white orchid in a sleek ceramic vase. Minimalist. Sterile. I moved to the dining room and stopped cold. On the table, my grandmother's table, mind you, carved by her father with hands that fled famine, was a manila folder, opened halfway, its contents fanned out like a wound. Inside were glossy real estate flyers with photos of my home, taken while I was dying. Charming Southern Colonial, the headline read, perfect for young families, move-in ready. And there, at the bottom of the page, was the agent's name, Delaney Morgan. She had been in Alyssa's book club. I remembered bringing cookies to one of their meetings. I stared at the flyer for a long time, tracing the edge of the printed photo. They'd taken shots of the backyard swing set, the old oak tree with the initials Frank carved into the bark, the sunroom where I used to drink my coffee and read poetry in the quiet mornings before anyone woke up. None of them had asked me if I was ready to let those things go. None of them had even asked if I was coming home. Bradley hovered near the kitchen, awkward, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. I heard him mumble something like, "It's just preliminary, nothing's been signed yet." Liar. I walked past him and into the hallway, toward the room that used to be mine. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and stared at the space, blinking through the sunlight that fell in awkward stripes across the floor. Half my clothes were folded into plastic donation bags. The dresser drawers were empty. A few sweaters hung on mismatched hangers, most of them not even mine. It looked like a room waiting for someone else. Or worse, like someone had already moved in. The closet door was open, and that's when I saw it. A red cardboard box, barely fitting beneath the bed frame, its edges worn, and the label written in bold black ink. Old docs. Taxes. Something about the neatness of it made me pause. Alyssa had never been that organized, not when it came to my things. I crouched slowly, still sore, and reached for it. That's when Bradley appeared in the doorway. "Oh, Mum, that's just old invoices and stuff. You don't need to go through that. Boring legal junk, really." His voice was too quick, too rehearsed. I looked at him, not with suspicion, but with something colder, recognition. He was lying. I didn't say a word. I didn't pull the box out. I just stood, slowly, using the cane to brace myself, and left the room. If there was one thing teaching high schoolers for 3 decades taught me, it was how to recognize the panic in a person who'd just been caught a bit red-handed. Bradley had it all over his face, slick with guilt, eyes darting, shoulders drawn like he expected to be yelled at. But I didn't yell. That's not who I was anymore. Instead, I went to the kitchen, sat down in my old chair, the one with the wobbly leg Frank never got around to fixing, and folded my hands in my lap. I let the silence wrap around me like a funeral veil. From that chair, I could see the whole downstairs, all the things they'd scrubbed clean of me. The art from Emma's kindergarten year that used to hang on the fridge, now gone. The old mug rack that Frank had built from pine wood, replaced by a Keurig and disposable pods. My cookbooks, missing. My spice rack, replaced with neutral labels and Pinterest aesthetics. They weren't just selling the house. They were repackaging my life as if I had never existed inside it. And they almost succeeded. Almost. I watched as Bradley left, muttering something about picking up Alyssa from the salon. He didn't look back. He didn't ask if I needed anything. The front door clicked shut with a dull finality. I sat there for another 15 minutes. Then I reached for the red box. Because if they were bold enough to erase me while I was still breathing, then it was time I reminded them who had built every brick of this family from the ground up. I waited until the sun dipped low and the shadows crawled up the baseboards like fingers trying to hold me still. The house was silent, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that settles after a door's been slammed, after a truth has been buried. It was the silence of a home that no longer belonged to me. Bradley had left again, some vague errand involving Alyssa and curtain samples. He said it like I was a guest, not the woman who raised the very family he was pretending to speak for. That was when I finally pulled the red box into the center of the room and opened it. The top layer was what he'd promised: old tax folders, brittle receipts, home warranty paperwork from years ago. But beneath that was something different. Tucked between manila envelopes and dusty plastic sleeves was a thin black leather folder. Inside, a copy of a quitclaim deed, a notary stamp, my name, their signatures, dated just weeks after my hip surgery. The power of attorney I'd signed under morphine haze had already been activated. They had used it, already moved things into motion. And I, stupid, trusting me, had handed them the pen. A sharp noise broke through the stillness. I looked up, startled. It was just the kitchen clock. Frank's old wall clock, ticking rhythmically above the pantry door. I hadn't noticed it before. I rose and walked toward it, standing beneath the soft ticking. His clock still ran perfectly. After all this time, after all this neglect, that damn thing never missed a beat. I reached up and adjusted it by a minute, just to feel like I still had power over something in this house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I laid on the guest bed. They had stripped mine, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazy circles above my head. Each rotation felt like a countdown to something I hadn't yet decided. I could feel the house pushing against me, every corner now unfamiliar. It wasn't my home. It was their project. Restless, I got up and wandered the hallway. That's when I saw it. Alyssa's old iPad was still plugged into the wall outlet in the pantry nook. I remembered buying it for her years ago, back when she had some brief fantasy about launching a lifestyle blog. She never followed through. Too busy, too tired, too entitled, but apparently not too busy to forget to log out. I tapped the screen. It blinked on. No password. Messages. The thread was still open, between her and Madeline. I didn't mean to read it. That's a lie. I devoured every word. House goes on MLS Monday. If she's still not home, we'll get intake going at Willow Pines. I already toured the rooms. Let's be honest. Mum was never good at boundaries. Brad says she might be too out of it to fight, but we need her to sign the final papers anyway, just to keep it clean. What if she doesn't? Then we get creative. There it was. Not just apathy, not just avoidance. This was orchestration. They were erasing me with white gloves on. I stared at the screen, my hands cold despite the humid night air. My own daughters, writing about me like I was a checklist, an inconvenience, an obligation they could file away under elder care logistics. I didn't cry. I'd already buried that reflex. Instead, I walked straight to the linen closet, opened the tin box I kept tucked behind the bath towels, the one no one ever thought to look through. Inside it, my handwritten password log, a relic from 1998. It held account numbers, phone extensions, banking questions, things they hadn't thought to dig for yet. And as I stared at that notebook, at my own neat penmanship from a life I had fought tooth and nail to build, something clicked back into place in me. Not rage, not yet. Resolve. I picked up the landline, the one they hadn't unplugged yet, and dialed. It took 2 rings for him to answer. Omar Kenton Law Office, a voice answered, warm and steady. Still the same voice from years ago. Still the same boy who once called me Ms. Renner, with such reverence that it made my day every time. Omar, I said, voice flat. It's Margaret. Margaret Renner. There was a pause. Then, Ms. Renner, are you okay? No, I said simply. But I'm ready to fix that. I need your help. He didn't ask for details. He knew the sound of someone who'd made up her mind. Tell me everything, he said. I did. Every word. Every signature. Every silence. Every room that no longer smelled like home. He listened in complete quiet. And when I finished, he said something that made my lungs expand for the first time in days. You're not the first, but we can stop this. You still have rights. Let's reclaim them. That word, reclaim, it stayed with me even after I hung up. Back in the living room, I sat once more in my wobbly chair. The house felt quieter now, not because it was empty, but because I had chosen silence this time. Not theirs, mine. The wedding photo sat on the floor, still face down. I picked it up. The glass was cracked across Frank's face, a spiderweb fracture right between his eyes. I turned it over and placed it on the mantel, not as a tribute, but as a reminder. They could try to erase me, but they'd never taught me how to disappear. The next morning, I met Omar at his office just after it opened. He had made space for me, physically and emotionally. His assistant cancelled a meeting so he could sit with me for as long as I needed. He didn't speak much when I walked in. He just pulled out the chair across from his, like he already knew the weight I was carrying didn't need another question, it needed action. He had grown into his role well. Confident posture, grey at his temples now, but his eyes still held that quiet sharpness I'd once seen in the front row of my classroom. Back then, he used to underline entire books in red pen. Not for grammar, but for betrayal. He said the human heart broke best in literature. He never expected to see it break across from his own desk. I ran the first round of financials, he said, pushing a printout across the table toward me. You were right to be suspicious. He tapped his pen against a transaction highlighted in yellow. $12,000, labeled as emergency hospitalization expense. Pulled from one of your joint accounts with Alyssa, just days after your stroke. I leaned in, reading the line over and over. I tried to summon surprise, but at this point, betrayal felt like muscle memory. It didn't go to the hospital, he added. I checked with Memorial General. That money never reached billing. Know where it went? He slid another sheet across the desk. There, bold and disgusting, was a wire transfer record. Destination, Bendel & Co., LLC. Account holder, Bradley Mendel. Purpose, consulting debt recovery, capital reseed. I stared at that name. His name. Bradley. The man who greeted me with lukewarm coffee and a half smile while my wedding photo sat boxed like garbage in the corner of my home. Bradley, whose business supposedly collapsed last year, who had the gall to act surprised when I returned to the house alive. I looked at Omar, my voice flat. He used my stroke to refund his failed company? Omar nodded. It gets worse. That power of attorney you signed after your hip surgery, the broader version, they activated it 2 days after your stroke, which technically isn't illegal if the principal is incapacitated. But they didn't just use it to make medical decisions. They leveraged it to secure financial authority and initiated the house transfer process. He paused. They were mid-negotiation with a buyer. So that was it. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had capitalized on me. Every second I spent gasping for air in that hospital, they were making spreadsheets. Every heartbeat bought back by defibrillator pads had a $sign next to it. I had become more valuable unconscious than present. My name was no longer a mother. It was an asset. I didn't cry, not even close. Tears were for grief. This was war. I sat back, folded the documents, and looked at Omar through the quiet resolve I hadn't used since the day I signed Frank's DNR papers. I raised those girls to be strong, I said, to think critically, to question convenience. I raised them to protect what matters. My voice didn't shake, but my hands did. Barely. I taught them integrity. I held up the wire transfer slip between my fingers like a funeral invitation. Apparently, they took other lessons more seriously. Omar nodded, but said nothing. I met his gaze. I want it undone. We can file to rescind the power of attorney and reinstate your legal autonomy, he said, already pulling out forms. Once that's done, we immediately halt any property negotiations and reassert sole ownership of the house. Do it, I said, and I want the sale listed again, but under my name this time. He blinked. You still want to sell? I paused for a moment, fingers tightening around the edge of the table. I don't want to save the house, I said. I want to empty it before they do. 3 days later, I signed a fresh contract with a different real estate agent, a professional woman named Sharon, who reminded me of myself in my early 40s, precise, calm, no time for nonsense. Together, we restaged the house, but this time, honestly. No whitewashed frames, no airbrushed furniture, just the truth. A house built on 40 years of laughter and loss, now seeking its next chapter. While she worked, I moved room to room, deciding what would stay and what would follow me into the unknown. The wedding photo? I kept it. Frank's watch? That too. Emma's drawings, done in crayon on printer paper? Absolutely. Everything else. The furniture, the dishes, the rugs I once vacuumed on my knees. Gone. I changed the locks. Then, through the Ring camera, I left a message for Bradley. Your tools are still in the garage. You have 24 hours to pick them up. After that, I donate them. He came quietly the next day. Didn't knock. Didn't speak. Just gathered his drills and hammers and left the gate open like a coward fleeing a battlefield he didn't expect me to survive. I closed every bank account they had access to, opened new ones under the name Nora Wittmann, my grandmother's maiden name. I had it printed on a new driver's license, a new checkbook, a new P.O. box in a town none of them knew existed. I sold the house 11 days later. All cash, no contingencies. I kept just enough for the road. The rest I stashed in money orders and sealed in a travel pouch beneath the passenger seat of my aging Corolla, the same car Alyssa once called embarrassing. That night, I sat in the empty living room on a folding chair, eating a peanut butter sandwich off a paper plate. I wrote 2 letters, one for each daughter. I didn't scold them. I didn't accuse. I simply said, "Thank you for the education. You've taught me who you are, and now I get to choose who I am." I left both letters on the counter. I unplugged the fridge. I took the spare key from the ceramic frog in the yard, and I drove out of Savannah by sunrise. No GPS, no plan. Just the hum of the road and the sudden relief of no one expecting me anymore. The town sign came into view just as the last of the early morning fog peeled off the road. It was small, wooden, hand-painted in faded red. "Welcome to Elkport, Maine, where everyone knows your name." It made me smile, not because of its warmth, but because I knew it would take more than a few potlucks and a library card for anyone to truly know mine again. I hadn't planned on Elkport. The name hadn't meant anything to me until I saw it on a billboard somewhere off I-95. "Friendliest library in the Northeast. Elkport welcomes you." That was it. That was the deciding factor. I turned off the exit and never looked back. The town was the kind of place that still sold hand-knit mittens in the hardware store, and where the post office doubled as the town's unofficial gossip mill. It smelled of wood smoke and damp pine. People said morning just to fill the space between their steps and yours. I found a trailer for rent behind a bait shop. 58 steps from the marsh, fully furnished, and $580 a month. Cash only, no lease required. The man who showed it to me, Jim, only asked one question. "You smoke?" "I don't," I said. He handed me the key and said, "You're good then." No ID, no references, no history required. I introduced myself as Nora Wittmann, retired school librarian from Roanoke, Virginia. Widowed, no kids. Looking for a quiet restart. Nobody questioned it. In towns like Elkport, people assumed you were either grieving or hiding, and respected you more for either. I began volunteering at the library 3 days a week, mostly shelving books, helping elderly patrons reset their email passwords, and dusting off corners no one else bothered to reach. It was simple, quiet work. The kind of work that didn't require explanations, the kind that made my hands useful again. That's where I met Lily. She was 27, sharp-witted, tired-eyed, and juggling too much at once. Her daughter Emma was 6 years old and spoke with the kind of confidence you only earn by surviving chaos with a giggle. Emma latched onto me like I was the puzzle piece that had been missing all along. She started calling me Nana Nora on her third visit to the library after I helped her glue glitter stars onto a construction paper bookmark. I didn't correct her. For the first time in years, I let a name wrap around me without protest. It fit. Lily and I developed a quiet rhythm. She'd drop Emma off at the library during her shifts at the diner. I'd keep her entertained with origami frogs, alphabet scavenger hunts, and readings of old fairy tales I'd once used to tuck my own daughters into bed, back when bedtime still meant something. We didn't talk much about where I came from. She didn't pry. I didn't offer. The mutual silence between women who'd been burned before. The days melted into something close to peace. Until the video. It was Emma's 7th birthday. Nothing fancy. Just a few streamers, some dollar store balloons, and a long table in the back of the VFW hall covered in mismatched paper plates. I helped Lily set up the cupcakes and corral the juice boxes. Emma insisted I sit beside her while she opened presents. I wore a party hat without even realizing it. One of the other mums filmed the moment Emma opened a glittery journal and squealed. In the video, I'm in the background, smiling, clapping, handing her the next gift, reading aloud one of the cards from her classmates. I looked like any other small-town grandmother, and for a brief second, I felt like one. 3 days later, Lily burst into the library, phone clutched in her hand, eyes wide with panic. "Nora," she said, breathless, You need to see this. The video had gone viral, picked up by a mommy blog, then a TikTok account known for reuniting lost family members and chasing down small-town mysteries. The caption was brutal. Found her. The ICU. Grandma who vanished. She's alive. She's got a new family, and we love her even more now. The comments exploded. She's a legend. This is what survival looks like. Her kids should be investigated for elder abuse. Imagine leaving your mum on a hospital bed to go sip mojitos in Hawaii. My name was trending again, but this time under someone else's rules. Photos of the old real estate flyer had resurfaced. Public data had been pulled. Speculation ran rampant. People wanted to know where I was, why I left, if I planned to press charges. I turned off the Wi-Fi. I cleared the browser history, but it was too late. The next day, I saw it. A silver Toyota with South Carolina plates, idling slowly past the library parking lot, like a shark circling its old waters. Madeline stepped out. She didn't look like someone prepared for a confrontation. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. Her cardigan was wrinkled, her eyes red-rimmed. She clutched a coffee cup like it might anchor her. I watched her through the blinds. 5 minutes passed. Then I stepped outside. She stared at me, unsure if I was real. Then her lips parted. "Mom," she whispered, "please, don't walk away." Her voice cracked, just a little, but I heard it. I didn't flinch, I didn't soften. I looked her square in the face and said, "I already held the funeral, Madeline. You just weren't there." Her breath hitched like I'd slapped her, and for once she didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't explain. She just stood there, holding a paper cup and the weight of every decision she'd tried to make disappear. I turned and walked back inside the library, not out of cruelty, but because I had finally learned not every apology deserves a seat at the table you had to rebuild alone. 3 days after Madeline's visit, an envelope appeared in the library return slot. It wasn't addressed to Maggie or even Nora, just a simple, quiet script. To her. I recognized the handwriting before I ever opened it. Alyssa. I let the envelope sit on my table for 2 nights. I didn't touch it, didn't even move it. It just sat there, unopened, pulsing like a small, stubborn ghost in the center of my kitchen. On the 3rd morning, I tore it open. Inside was the ICU letter I had written with shaking hands when I thought I might not make it. "If I don't wake up, I forgive you, but if I do, please come. I'm scared." Except this time, it had company. Dozens of notes, margin scribbles, ink smudges, desperate confessions, scrawled in Alyssa's hand. I didn't think it was that bad. I thought Madeline would go. I was scared too. "I'm sorry, Mum. Please don't erase us. Please." I stared at it for a long time, and then slowly, I folded it back up and slid it into the same notebook where I kept all the fake details of Nora Wittmann's new life. I tucked it beside the page titled, "No Contact. Peace." That same afternoon, I received an email at the library. Somehow Alyssa had found the public address. "Just once," she wrote. "No cameras, no Rick, just me. I'll bring the letter. Please, Mum." I read it 10 times before replying. Then I wrote 3 words: 1 visit, cemetery, Saturday. I arrived early. It was grey and still, the kind of sky that pressed down, like it didn't want to let go. I sat on the old bench beside Frank's headstone, smoothing the edges of my coat, watching the wind dance across the grass. I hadn't been back since the day we lowered him into the ground. It looked the same, weathered, honest. There was moss growing along the base now, just enough to soften the name without erasing it. Frank had always said death didn't scare him. "What scares me," he'd whispered once, "is being forgotten while I'm still here." I thought of that a lot in the ICU. A car pulled up slowly near the gates. White blouse, dark jeans, heels that didn't belong on gravel. Alyssa stepped out like someone walking into church after missing too many Sundays. She clutched a tote bag like it was armor. Her eyes flicked to mine, then down to Frank's grave, then back again. She approached, stopping 3 feet short. Then, with trembling hands, she held out the envelope. The letter, now visibly worn at the edges. I took it. She sat beside me, not too close, just close enough to let the silence feel thick, not heavy. "I read it every day," she said. "The one you wrote from the hospital." I said nothing. "I didn't know how to deal with you getting weak," she whispered. "You were always the strong one. You never asked for help." I let that hang in the air. Then I turned to her, voice steady. "I didn't need you to be strong. I needed you to show up." She nodded slowly, like the words were bricks she was finally willing to carry. "You think I don't hate myself?" she asked, almost pleading. "You think I sleep at night?" I turned toward her fully now. "I think you sleep better than I did, wondering why my daughters couldn't be bothered to hold my hand while I bled into a hospital bed." Her breath hitched, and finally she cried. Not quiet, manipulative tears, real ones. Gut-wrenching, face in hands, snot and all sobs. The kind of crying you do when there's nothing left to pretend about. I let her sit in it, let her feel every second of what she had chosen to ignore. Then I said, softly, clearly, "I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm just done." She looked up, mascara running, desperate. "Can I visit again?" "No," I said gently. "Letters?" she asked. "You can send them to Lily's P.O. box, but I won't promise to read them." She stood, wiping her face. The wind caught her hair. She took a step forward, arms slightly open, just slightly. "Can I hug you?" I stepped back, firm but not cruel. "That part of me," I said, "you already buried. And this time, I got to choose the funeral." The next morning, I sat at my small kitchen table, opened a fresh page in my notebook, and wrote, "You did it." I let the words settle. Then underneath, "You got out." I listed everything I had left behind. A house that forgot me, a name that no longer served me, a family that believed blood was a contract I could never break. Then I listed what I had gained: quiet mornings, real conversations, a child's laugh that didn't come with strings, a woman named Lily who saw me not as someone to inherit from, but someone who brought value now. I sealed the letter and wrote on the outside in big block letters, "To Nora Wittmann, keep." I tucked it into the shoebox beneath my bed, next to Emma's drawings and a single photo of my daughters, taken long before they learned what the word inheritance meant. That afternoon, I helped Lily trim the hedges outside her porch. Emma ran up, cheeks flushed with the wind, holding a chipped seashell in both hands. "Nana!" she shouted, eyes bright. "Look what I found. It's broken, but still pretty." I knelt beside her. I took the shell, turned it over in my palm. "It's perfect," I said. "Let's go build something with it." We sat in the sand, stacking seashells and damp driftwood. Not because everything had healed, but because I finally understood. You don't have to be whole to feel at peace. You just have to stop giving your pieces away to those who broke them. Not everyone who shares your blood deserves your loyalty, and not every act of walking away is weakness. Sometimes it's the only way back to yourself. If you've ever had to choose peace over family, dignity over forgiveness, or yourself over those who never chose you, this story is for you. Share it. Someone out there needs to know they're not alone. And if that someone is you, I see you. Stay. Comment. Say your name again. This time, for you.